Welcome to another episode of the Thirst for More podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Spitley, and today's episode is going to be Stuck in the Hole, how pause squats can unlock your actual squat potential. So to get going here really quickly, I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal story about pause squats, how I think they're super beneficial, super underrated. They become more popular as of late, but I got a whole episode here for you today on just the pause squat itself. So from my personal story here, let's just take this scenario that probably sounds familiar if you're having issues with your squat, that you've been squatting super consistently, months, maybe even years, and you've worked your way up to a pretty respectable number. But you've kind of hit this plateau or sticking point. It seems like no matter what you do, adding weight to the bar, your squat's not making the progress that you hoped it would. So your regular squat is starting to feel stuck. You start pulling out different bags of tricks or trying to figure out what can I do to aid my squat. And for many people, they start to wonder if they've hit a ceiling or what is the secret sauce, right? And what if I told you that the solution isn't necessarily always lifting heavier, but actually spending more time under tension under the bar in the most challenging position of the lift, right? That's what the pause squat is and what it does. And it takes a very basic, classic exercise like the back squat, ups an ante with one minor tweak and deviation. And for me personally, I was introduced to the pause squat back in probably 2011, 2012, somewhere around there when Brian Carroll started doing my programming. If any of you are familiar with Brian Carroll, he actually was beginning to work with some of the raw lifters. This is when raw was not nearly as popular in terms of powerlifting. It was starting to just gain some traction. Equipped was still pretty much the name of the game, and lifters were getting out of the equipment. And so Brian, at least from what he did from my programming, said that, hey, this is an area where you can stand to get a lot stronger and improve in being a raw lifter without all the support at the bottom. The pause squat's going to kind of be your secret sauce because you're already a strong squatter, at least for myself, I already was, without any kind of tricks. But we were trying to get me to that elusive 500. So just to give you an idea, my best squat, I think, in the time of competition when Brian took me on, I believe was 435 at 132, to give you an idea. So kind of a long ways to go, but he saw my potential in that exercise and thought that the pause squat was kind of the bread and butter, and turns out it actually was. So that's kind of how I got into the pause squat game and actually truly learning about it and actually getting it programmed for me. That was my first exposure, my first way of learning about it, and actually having a coach walk me through it, which I think is also incredibly beneficial for most people. So today we're going to dive deep into the pause squat, and we're going to take a systematic approach that can really transform your training if you're not using them. If you are, I might even be able to give you some more tricks and tips along the way to help you with your pod squat. And by just adding those few seconds to each rep, how that really ups the ante of the progress that you can see. So I'm not really talking anything about trendy or any kind of hack here by any means. This is just solid training advice. Okay. Will it apply to you? It could not. It should theoretically, but everybody is clearly built different. We all have different issues with the technical aspect of our lifts, whether that be the squat, the bench press, the deadlift, or any other physical exercise that you're implementing in your training program, right? So I would just want to make a disclaimer that the pause squat should help you, but at the same time, it could not, because if that's not an area that you're having issues, then it kind of defeats the purpose to be working on something where you're not having an issue, right? But the pause squat itself is pretty much backed by science in terms of isometrics. Elite powerlifters are clearly using it, weightlifters, and strength coaches as well. Like, we all use this exercise to some degree in some fashion at the point in our careers. And so we're going to kind of dive deeper into that. So over this next, 40 to 60 minutes, I never truly plan out my episodes in terms of like the length. I try to just get a ballpark range. So to give you an idea, I clearly do my homework and do my notes as well here as I'm looking at my screen to give you some more information. But we're going to go down exactly why the pause squat works, the precise protocols that I like to use to get results, how you can implement them starting this week in your training. So if you need to make adjustments to your training, how you can immediately take actionable steps, And whether you're actually in a plateau or in a sticking point with your squat, you're just wanting to bulletproof that lower position of the squat and the strength, in the weakest biomechanical position, or you're getting ready for a meet competition, this episode should give you the complete roadmap and guide to being able to master that pause squat. So let's get the foundation out of the way here. What are pause squats and why should you be using them, or why, from a training perspective, could they be valuable, or should they be pretty much valuable in more cases than not? So again, to really start with the basics here, because understanding the basics of how isometrics work and what we're doing from a pause perspective, to me, a big piece of training is understanding the why you're doing something. It's one thing to blindly follow a plan, and while you can certainly make progress doing that, I think if you genuinely care about your training or implementing training with other people, you really got to understand the why. And if you can answer the why, your training has more meaning, it has more depth, and it lets you problem solve. And really, at the end of the day, training is just problem solving using strength and conditioning methods, science, research, things that we know that have stood the test of time in terms of training. Even though we come out with new stuff all the time, if you get on Instagram or TikTok, you're going to see exercises that are absolutely wild. The basics clearly work, but we're going to kind of dive into what works well for this particular exercise. So pause squat, just to clear this up, is essentially just your regular barbell back squat, but you're going to add a deliberate stop or pause in the bottom position, and what we like to call the hole or the bottom of the squat. But where most people get it wrong is that this isn't just stopping for the sake of just stopping, right? We're not just trying to make the squat harder to make the squat harder. Yes, it's going to be harder, but we're not just doing that to increase the intensity for no good reason. Now, you certainly could if you really wanted to, but that's usually not why you're going to try to program an exercise, just to make it harder, right? You got to have a reason, going back to that why. So think of it like this. If you're driving down a hill and you rely on your brakes to stop, so that's what a regular squat does, is relying on our brakes to stop. Where your regular squat, you actually rely on the stretch shortening cycle, stretch reflex, however you want to, how you're used to hearing that, basically the same thing, and the elastic energy to bounce from the bottom. It's what makes the squat nice, is that if you use that stretch shortening cycle efficiently, you can be really good in the bottom position. And some of this is genetic related, how long you've trained, what kind of sports you've done, your training history, all that does matter. We're all going to be different. Some people are faster lifters, some people are slower lifters. But now imagine that you're on that same hill, but now you have to come to a complete stop and put the car in park, then count for a duration of time, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then accelerate back up that hill from that dead stop. That's basically what a pause squat is going to do from a muscular nervous system perspective. Okay, that's the everyday layman's term of really what's happening with this exercise. But the key difference here is that during a regular squat, you're utilizing what's called that stretch shortening cycle or the stretch reflex. And so your muscles and your tendons, they store that elastic energy as you descend like a rubber band. I've kind of talked about this in other podcast episodes and different videos on my channel. We like to use that rubber band analogy in the strength and conditioning field, that when you create more tension on that band, that it's going to snap back faster. Essentially, the squat, we get that out of our glutes and our hamstrings, our lower body muscles. And then we release that energy, and that's what helps you up out of the bottom. So just understand that that's kind of where this goes in the science of the stretch shortening cycle. And then the pause is going to help take that away or reduce that training effect. So with pause squats, we're deliberately trying to interrupt that stretch shortening cycle, forcing you to have to generate more force from a dead stop in the most mechanically disadvantaged position of the movement, right? We usually come to your squat, the bottom position is going to be the biggest stretch that we're getting on those muscles because of that disadvantaged position that we're in biomechanically. So here's the problem that pause squats help solve. So most people who squat regularly will tell you that if they're going to fail a rep, it happens in one of two places, either right out of the hole at the bottom or about halfway up in terms of what we would call the sticking point, okay? Or your mini max, or your plateau. There's different words for it. You probably have heard several different things, But usually for most people in squatting without equipment, right there at the very bottom or just out of the bottom as you're coming out, you might call it that, halfway position, give or take. But here's what I found interesting is that research shows that the vast majority of squat failures actually begin at the bottom, even if the bar doesn't physically stop moving until higher up. And so if you know me, you know I'm pretty pro conjugate. I love bands and chains, and this is a huge benefit of band and chain training, right? You can't get this without bands and chains, is that you get the overspeed eccentrics, which are going to help improve that stretch shortening cycle. You're going to get more loaded energy, and that should help you come out of the bottom a little bit. And it's going to teach you to accelerate harder through positions, which then helps move that mini max or that sticking point. And the same thing with chains. You're not going to get as much of the stored energy because the chains do not have those overspeed eccentrics, but you're still going to get a similar training effect, and then you're having to drive up through the barbell, through that mini max as the accommodating resistance kicks in, right? So going from a biomechanic perspective, at the bottom of the squat, your hip and your knee joints are at their most acute angles. So your quads are stretched to their longest length, your glutes are in a deep stretch position, and you're obviously not only battling the weight of the barbell, but obviously gravity, which is what makes lifting weights, and with the worst leverage possible from your body. You have the worst leverages in the bottom to move weight. That's why it's the hardest position. So if you can't generate enough force right there immediately when you need to, now everything that happens afterward in the ascent is compromised because of that position. And so when I talk to lifters, or if I look at people's training videos, or I even work with people in the gym and I'm assessing what's going on with their squat, big thing I try to tell people is how you enter the bottom or the hole of the squat is usually how you're going to exit the bottom or the hole of the squat. Not always, okay, not always, but more cases than not, the position that you enter that is going to be how you get out of it. So you enter in bad position, that's not good. Then you're also going to not also be in that disadvantaged position biomechanically, as well as being in bad position down and coming out. And so you're more likely to miss it more so than if you were in good position. So there's several things that can happen there, not just from a strength perspective and biomechanics perspective, but also from a technique perspective. So let's just take, for example, an athlete can squat 315 pounds for a solid triple in the gym, but when they try 325, they descend pretty normally. They pause for just half a second at the bottom. They gather themselves, then they struggle to stand up, right? So what happened in that 325 versus that 315? They basically turned their regular squat into a pause squat. And then suddenly their strength dropped significantly because they weren't trained for that demand, right? I've even been there, okay? Even when I squatted, as the weights got heavier, especially in your maximal weights, you really, really slow down there in the bottom to try to make sure you enter that position correctly. However, when you enter that really slow, every eccentric to concentric is going to have an isometric. And this comes from the triphasic training aspect of Cal Dietz. I highly suggest you read that book if you're into strength and conditioning training. You will learn a lot from that book in terms of eccentrics, concentrics, and isometrics and how to implement the training, especially from an athletic performance perspective. But what I want you to gather here from that is that every eccentric going into a concentric has to have an isometric at some point. At some point, the movement on the reversal is actually to come to a small, brief period of time where it is motionless. And that is the isometric. Okay. You're always going to have that. Now, it may not be very long, right? It may be as fast as that, especially really fast lifters, but there is going to be an isometric there. But going back to like someone like myself, where that approaches heavier weights and you go towards the bottom and you start to yield and stop to be able to change direction, right? You slow down, you're increasing that isometric time. And when you increase that isometric time, you make the repetition harder. You're not trying to do that. You're trying to enter the position into an ideal position so that you can come out in an ideal position. But if you slow down, now you're kind of hurting yourself. Well, so you got to learn how to train fast and controlled, quote unquote, here. For those of you that are listening to me on Spotify or Apple iTunes and not on YouTube, where you can also catch us on YouTube, you'll find that that's what's going to happen. So that's using this example. That's what happened is that by adding 10 more pounds to the barbell, the lifter slowed down to control their position and actually increased their isometric time because of that reversal aspect of the eccentric and the concentric. So This is exactly why pod squats can be incredibly valuable in your training, because they force you to develop that strength and that stability in your weakest position. Instead of being weak in the chain down there in the bottom, you can now create more strength, confidence, and tightness, and that will translate into your lift whenever you go to just do a normal back squat, or any kind of back squat variation for that matter. So when you consistently train the pod squats, several things are going to happen that directly transfer into your regular squatting and just your overall strength. So first, you're going to develop what we call starting strength. Okay, if you've never heard of this, it's the ability to generate the maximum amount of force from a static position. Okay, now usually we think about starting strength when you think about the deadlift or lifting off pins or doing like a dead stop variation like a pin leg row, right? That's going to work on starting strength. You have to get the weight moving from a complete dead stop. So isometrics in terms of the pod squat can help develop that as well. Secondly, you improve your motor control and proprioception in the bottom position, which then, as I mentioned, leads back to better balance and stability. And thirdly, you build some serious mental toughness, because sitting in that position with a heavy load, uncomfortable, in the weakest position of the lift, under load, and then driving it out requires incredible focus mentally, physically, and also technically, right? As I mentioned, if you enter that position in a bad position, if you enter the bottom in a bad position, I'll clear that up a little for you. If you enter the bottom in a bad position, you're more likely to leave in a bad position. So pod squats help you focus on being in that optimal position. And by having a pause there, we get to spend more time there. We get more exposure. And that more exposure is then going to help us with that position in the future with our regular back squat. But arguably, most importantly, pod squats teach you to own every inch of the movement down there in the bottom specifically. But even on the eccentric, when you're lowering the rep and you're going into the bottom, you still got to be in the right positions. So when you go back to your regular squatting, or even just, you are still continuing to back squat, you should be able to notice that even after a block of doing pod squats, that bottom position should feel better and more familiar rather than uncertain, uncomfortable, or even have you entering or exiting in bad positions to begin with. So let's kind of take some of the muscle physiology piece of it, the science behind it, the time under tension piece of it here. So to really understand why pod squats are so effective, we need to dive into what's happening inside your muscles during the actual pause itself. So when you hold that position or load, you're creating what's called an isometric contraction. So I've been kind of throwing in these words: concentric, isometric, eccentric. We're going to mainly talk about the isometric aspect of it. So this is different from the concentric when you're lifting the weight up, or the eccentric when you're lowering it down, right? There's different adaptations that occur from that. We know that eccentrics are very stressful. They generally lead to more delayed onset muscle soreness. But there's also benefits to each one of them, each phase of the lifts as well, depending upon what you're trying to do. So during an isometric contraction, your muscle fibers are firing and generating force, but the muscle isn't changing any length at all. Okay, so it's pretty much, if my hands are intertwined here, the isometric is just going to just stay like this. So what you can't see is I'm actually pulling my fingers apart, but they're not going anywhere. Okay, so I'm creating an isometric contraction. The eccentric would be if they're coming apart and the pulling is more than the squeeze, and then they start to break apart. That would be the eccentric. The concentric would be if they came together during the reps. Think about your bicep curl. When you're doing that, that's what the fibers are doing. So you get an idea of kind of what's happening at the fiber level. So your muscles are working, and pretty hard typically, but nothing is actually moving. Now, to make a brief disclaimer here, in a pod squat, you probably are moving a little bit, right? You're clearly going to be a little unstable. You could be moving down just a little bit or up just a little bit, but ideally you're going to be as rigid as possible. So the isometric contraction has some unique properties that make it pretty valuable for strength development because of that. So first off, isometric contractions tend to recruit motor units differently than your normal dynamic movements that you're thinking of in terms of like the eccentric or jumping or things of that nature. So motor units are like the individual teams of muscle fibers. It's the best way I can describe it here. And during that isometric hold, your nervous system often recruits higher threshold motor units, the powerful, fast twitch, they're responsible for maximum strength and power. And it's like your body's way of saying, whoa, hold up. We're in trouble here. We need to call in the big guys. We need to just get this shit taken care of, right? So that's what we're going to do. Secondly, and this is crucial for understanding pause squats, is that isometric strength is highly specific to joint angle. Okay, that is a key takeaway that we learn in academia whenever I took all my classes and you're taking certifications and we're talking about athletic performance, right? We talk about joint angles, being joint angle specific, and isometrics are very joint angle specific. So if you get stronger holding that squat at 90 degrees of deflection, being in that 90 degrees at the bottom of your squat, you'll see the biggest strength gains, at that exact angle, plus or minus a couple degrees. Okay, I don't have that exactly in front of me. I think it's 10 to 15 degrees is kind of the sweet spot of give that you're given. So ideally you want to be at 90 degrees, but if you're a tad high or a tad low, theoretically the research shows that you've got a little bit of wiggle room as well. So this is why pause squats at the bottom are so effective, because you're training your body to be the strongest exactly where you're biomechanically at the weakest. So another fascinating piece, though, as well as I'm doing a little bit of research on this, is that during the pause, you're also challenging what's called intermuscular coordination. And this is your body's ability to coordinate multiple muscle groups to maintain that position and that stability. So your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings, your trunk, even your upper back, all have to work together to maintain that bottom position under load. And this coordination carries over beautifully to the normal dynamic aspects of squatting. A good looking squat is very dynamic in nature, right? And just any other athletic based movements that may involve jumping off two legs or squatting off two legs, right? So let's dive in a little bit to some research and evidence side here and kind of tell you what that says as well. So the research on pause squats and isometric training is pretty compelling for the most part, right? It's pretty well studied. A landmark study by Kubo and colleagues found that athletes who incorporated isometric training at specific joint angles saw strength improvements of 15 to 35% at those angles, with significant carryover to dynamic movements. So when we look specifically at pause squats, research by Hartman and others has also shown that powerlifters who regularly use pause squats tend to have better competition performance and fewer failed attempts at the bottom position. So that's also really interesting to find that even the research side has begun to show some of that as well. So one particular study also compared two groups of intermediate lifters over 8 weeks, and during one group performed back squats, and while the other group replaced 30% of their squatting volume with pause squats using 3-second pauses. So, right, we have two groups. One just did back squats. The other one reduced their volume or got 30% of their volume instead from pause squats versus regular squats using a 3-second pause. The pause squat group not only improved their pause squat strength by an average of 12%, but their regular squat improved by 8% compared to just 4% in the regular squat group. So basically almost double the gains from a percentage perspective. So that's also very interesting as well. Another one what's even more interesting is the research on time under tension and muscle hypertrophy. Okay, so while we're talking about joint angles and being isometrically strong in those positions and entering and exiting those positions, that's all great. Another aspect that is benefited from isometrics, one, but also the pause squat, two, is muscle hypertrophy. So while pause squats are primarily used as a strength tool, especially in the powerlifting world or the weightlifting world, studies have also shown that extended time under tension can also contribute to muscle growth, particularly in the quadriceps and the glutes, obviously because we're in that stretch. Those are the two muscles that are stretched pretty heavily. A study by Bird and colleagues demonstrated that longer time under tension, even at submaximal loads, can increase muscle protein synthesis rates. The research also shows us something important about transfer in that pause squats don't just make you better at pause squats, okay? Going back to the said principle of, basically you're going to get what you get out of a certain exercise. If you to do the exercise, to get better at exercise, you got to do the exercise, right? Specific adaptations to impose demands. But Not only do pause squats make you better at pause squats, they make you better at regular squats, front squats, and even movements like weightlifting movements like your snatch and your clean and jerk, where you can recover from a deep squat position when you catch those exercises. So that's also there. So the research is obviously very pro pause squats as well. Let's talk about the neurological adaptations. Okay, well, talking about muscles is great, and we're talking about joint angles is great, and how it's going to make you stronger. There's also neurological adaptations that are occurring as well. So at the nervous system side, this is where pause squats can really have a lot of benefit that I don't think people truly understand. So when you're holding that bottom position and obviously underneath load, your nervous system is basically learning and syncing up of how to recruit muscle fibers more efficiently and to coordinate them correctly in those movement patterns under stress. So the way I like to think of strength training just in general is that, especially when we talk about improving movement capacity, is that it's one thing to do a bodyweight squat. And bodyweight squats are probably going to make you somewhat better at squatting. But by adding load, we get a higher stimulus. And it's like amplifying what's going on at the nervous system side. And it's basically telling our body to make a better adaptation, because not only do we have to do the neurological aspect, we're getting the loading aspect, which gives a higher amplitude. Okay, it's the best way I can describe it. You're getting a higher amplitude from a nervous system side of what your body is trying to learn and co-coordinate and to get better at. That's partially what lifting weights is, as well as the nervous system side. So from a motor learning perspective, when you first learn to squat, right? I got a 1-year-old kid. I'm seeing this every single day. Nervous system was figuring out which muscles to fire, when to fire them, how hard to fire them. Right. My kid is a best example of this. Going back to this in several episodes now, but you can see it. And as a dad, especially somebody that enjoys movement and trains people for a living and other kids, I do kind of nerd out over this stuff and just watching him gain new skills. And that's a big portion of the neurological adaptations. So this process never really stops, though, in our lives, right? It's obviously very prominent at younger ages or newer skills because there's so much more ground to be made up, and we can clearly see the improvements maybe day after day, week after week, month after month. But your nervous system is constantly refining these patterns. Even the best in the world, there's a reason why specificity gets pushed really hard at the higher levels, is because they want to make that the most optimal movement pattern possible, and it's going to take repetitions after repetitions. So pause squats essentially force your nervous system to learn more challenging version of a squatting pattern, clearly in a position that we're not strong at. So during the pause, several important things are happening neurologically. First, you're developing what researchers call rate of force development. Okay, I've talked about rate of force development a lot. I've got several videos on my YouTube channel, which you can check out as well. I'll try to remember to link those in the description box below. But you're getting rate of force development from a static start position or that pause position. This is your ability to generate force quickly from zero velocity, which is crucial, not just for squatting, which we're making this about squatting, but for jumping, sprinting, and most athletic movements. Rate of force development is incredibly important. It's what makes elite athletes. Their rate of force development is typically unparalleled, right? Yes, they have to have skills, but if we're talking about people jumping high, jumping far, sprinting fast, rate of force development for those athletes is absolutely insane. And you don't know it until you take an average Joe and you put it next to somebody that's got a lot of rate of force development. It's very, very noticeable. Secondly, you're improving your proprioception. So your body's awareness of where it's at in space. And we do this all the time, every single day. Again, from a younger age, it's a little bit harder. And then as we get older, we kind of know when things are around us. But this still happens as well whenever we're squatting or even bench pressing or deadlifting or whatever. Right. So having a better awareness of where we are in space. But this is more important when you got a barbell with hundreds of pounds on your back and you're in a deep squat position. So the bottom of the squat is a complex position with multiple joints at extreme ranges of motion. And so spending time there under load, you're teaching your nervous system to better sense the control of this position. And this improved proprioception translates to better balance, stability, and movement quality in all other exercises. So perhaps most importantly, you're building what I like to call neurological confidence. Okay, you're not only mentally confident in there, but neurologically, your body is also confident down there. And so many lifters develop a fear or hesitation of the bottom position of their squat, especially early on when you start to actually train your squat. People avoid the squat for a long time because they're not good at it. But as you start to get stronger, that usually, as I talked about, people slowing down there towards the bottom, or they start to lose position, right? They'll lose some mental confidence, but also the neurological confidence as well, because they don't spend a whole lot of time down there. They don't want to spend a whole lot of time down there because they know that's the hardest part of the lift. So they rush through it. They avoid going to full depth because it feels unstable or weak. Pause squats systematically build confidence in that position. And when you can sit comfortably in the bottom with a significant weight on your back, your nervous system learns its position is also safe and manageable, especially when you're using submax loads and you're slowly building into this. You kind of know that effect of the nervous system freaking out, right? You kind of got to give your body exposure, but you want to be smart about how you're going about giving your body that exposure. And there's also an important physiological component here, that the mental challenge of sitting in an uncomfortable position under load and then generating the maximum amount of force to stand up builds incredible mental toughness that's going to carry over to all your training and competition scenarios. So I think mental training from a strength and conditioning perspective is huge. It's, to me, working with kids, especially a lot of young girls, you can see how the mental confidence of them getting stronger improves them to be able to do other things in life. But also it carries over to their training and their competition stuff. They've been in hard situations. They've been in lifting heavy weights. They've been uncomfortable. You're going to experience that from a competition perspective, especially for powerlifting, lifting with this. Now, if you're not a powerlifter, you're not competing, and you're just trying to learn more about the pause squat, then that mental toughness may not be as important, but I still think it's worth training just for life in general. All right. Let's move on to timing aspect and timing protocols. So how to optimize your pause squat protocols here. So from a practical side, how long should you actually pause? And this is where science and art of coaching kind of blend together, because the optimal pause duration is ultimately going to depend on your goals, your experience level, and where you're at in training cycles in your training career, right? So, I mean, yes, I can give you all this research and whatever, but a 1 count pause, a 2 count pause, a 3 count pause, or where they're at in your training, right? All that's going to change. Training should be somewhat specific to every individual. Can give you general guidelines, but ideally you're going to have to tweak it for what's best for you. So let's start with 1 count pauses, which I consider really kind of the entry point for most people, right? It's a 1 second, so it's just long enough to begin to eliminate the stretch reflex without being incredibly challenging. But it is going to somewhat reduce the weight that you use. Not a lot, but just a little bit. So think of it as touching the bottom position, making sure that you're actually there, briefly hanging out, like, okay, this is it. And then rather than bouncing out of it, now you can actually just go to drive up into the bar and get out of position. So for beginners, this is the best pause squat that you can use. It's perfect because it teaches the pattern without necessarily being overwhelming, taking major sacrifices to your numbers. Because if you happen to be one of those numbers people and you're like, man, my squat just dropped 50 pounds from doing this pause squat variation, you know, sometimes that can be a killer, right? So just being honest there with that one. However, something important to understand about counting as well is that when most people count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, right, they're actually pausing for only about half a second, right? So I recommend using either a nice slow count, 1001 or 1 and 1. Okay. I do that to myself. I say 1 and 1 because to me, I feel like I'm doubling the time, right? So it may not be exactly perfect, but I think you want to try to err on the side of caution of being down there longer than shorter, especially for the 1 count pauses. So slower count or 1,000, you know, you do what works best for you, but for me, 1 and 1 works really well to make sure you're actually getting the true 1 count pause. And I will have a full disclaimer here that many times when I program like 3 counts for athletes, even 2 counts, a lot of times I know I'm going to get about half that to a third of that. So if I give a 3 count, if I get a 2 count of the athlete, I'm pretty happy. And that's really kind of what I'm after. I'm kind of overextending. I've even gone up to giving 5 counts to people. And really what I'm wanting out of there is really a solid 3 count because I know they're probably going to count pretty quick. And if I go through any of my coaching notes and videos of athletes that I've worked with online, when they have pause squats, I guarantee you probably 50% of the time, I usually say something along the lines of that pause could have been a little longer, cut the pause a little short, Let's try making the pause a little bit more true next time, or being a little more honest with your pauses, right? It sucks to call out athletes, but also as a coach, that's part of your job. And the pause squat is one where people will definitely shortchange the time. So something worth considering there. So moving up to 2 to 3 second pauses. So this is where things get pretty interesting from a strength development standpoint. So research suggests that this duration is optimal for maximizing isometric strength gains while still allowing you to use pretty meaningful loads. So this is a sweet spot that most intermediate to advanced lifters should focus on for their general strength development. And from a practical side of me working with people, I will wholeheartedly agree. I think it's the nice sweet spot. So definitely a good place to start if you have any really solid amount of strength conditioning training underneath your belt. 2 to 3 count is probably going to be where it's at. So the key point that many people miss here is that the pause should be counted from when you stop moving, not from when you start descending or you get close, right? It should be once you've hit the brakes, now you start counting. So you descend under control, you come to that stop down there in the pause at that position or that relatively deep position, and then you start counting. Okay. Definitely another issue. And it could be a reason why some people kind of speed it up is they actually maybe are counting, honestly, maybe they're just counting too soon before they actually get to that paused or stop position. And so this actually ensures that you're getting the intended isometric stimulus, which is why you're implementing the exercise to begin with, right? So for power lifters that are preparing for a meet or competition, there are some specific things that mimic competition demand. So in powerlifting, you clearly go down to the bottom and then you come up on your own. And that's the point of the exercise in terms of powerlifting. So there is no up command from the squat position. So just make sure from a training perspective that when it comes to implementing isometrics and specifically pause squats, that you're still going to have more actual regular back squats to competition standards as you get pretty close to that meet. Because if you don't have any, you don't want to make that blunder of pausing in the bottom at a meet. I have seen it numerous times. So competitive powerlifters should practice pauses during or using different variations to get different stimulus they need going into the meet to help with tightness or what have you. But you really want to make sure that you're not doing it like 2 weeks out from the meet, right? You need to make sure that your specificity is closer towards the meet. Use the pauses to build up into the meet to develop the qualities that you need and then kind of pull it so that, again, we can be more specific towards the actual meet itself. So for advanced lifters, so I'm talking about really strong people, those looking to just really see the maximum benefit from pause squats and isometrics, a 5 count or even longer pauses are probably the best place to be. And according to Cal Dietz in his book, he seems to think that 6 seconds from what he found was the isometric sweet spot to genuinely take all the stretch shortening aspect out, or the stretch reflex, out of the stretch shortening cycle to basically completely nullify it. So I know I've not read that research. Trying to dig it up, I really could not find anything on that 6 seconds. It was just what I could find in his book. I'm going to take Cal Dietz's word for it that he did the research on that, considering he wrote that book on that. But they're obviously incredibly demanding. They require reducing the load, 60 to 70% of your 1 rep max, right? I mean, you're just going to see some pretty big hits on your numbers. That's a long time to sit down there. But the tightness, the patience, and the gains that you can get from it can be pretty damn impressive. Again, because if we go back to what Cal Dietz is claiming, and, again, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt here, and I too have used 6 second isometrics whenever I've used some triphasic stuff in my own programming and other powerlifters programming. It sucks. It really does. But I will say it also does work as well. Okay, let's talk about some programming strategies. So to actually fit pause squats into your training program, because this is also another place where many people go wrong in terms of the programming side. So the key principle is that the pause squat is a tool, right? It's not a replacement for all your squatting. That's kind of what I was getting at earlier from a meet prep perspective, is that yes, you can do a ton of pause squats in preparation for your competition, but you still need some sort of specificity in there, especially as you get really close to the meet. So they serve a purpose and should be programmed accordingly. So don't just completely ditch your regular back squats and just replace everything with pauses, right? It's just a tool. So from a frequency perspective, I usually recommend that most people incorporate pauses 1 to 2 times per week at the absolute most, depending upon their total training volume and their goals, right? If you're squatting 3 times a week, one of those sessions could just be a pause squat session, right? And then if you're squatting twice per week, you might have, again, one session that focuses a little bit more on the pauses, and maybe you got a secondary variation. So, for example, you might pause squat as your main movement for, say, 3 sets of 3 with a 3 count. And then your supplemental movement may end up being doing a box squat or a close stance squat with a high bar position or a safety bar squat, right? Attacking another need as well. Maybe that's your quads, for example. So different ways that you can go about it from that. But usually if you're going to be squatting at least 2 times a week, having one day where the pause squat is your like emphasis and your main go-to, I think is the way to go there. So timing it within your training sessions is also something. So they're clearly neurologically demanding because you're having to maintain that tightness, and they require great technique and mental focus, being able to count, entering position right, exiting position right. It's all important. It's always important when you squat, but more so because you're going to be spending a lot more time down there. I recommend doing them early in your training session when you're fresh, preferably as your main squat variation if it's your main pause squat day for sure, rather than necessarily an accessory lift as you're fatigued. The exception to this for me is if you happen to be using a conjugate system, you can use that as a main max effort movement for sure. Definitely have programmed that many times for many people, and I do like it. But I also like using pauses as a secondary or supplemental movement to the max effort movement that we did. So, for example, if we're doing, say, a safety bar squat against bands for a hard single, double, triple, whatever the day is, we might do 1 or 2 back downs depending upon the individual. The secondary exercise, we'll just stick with the safety bar and say hit 3 sets of 3 with 2 count pauses, right, for RP7 or something. So for me, that's the best way to sprinkle it in as well, is to, if you're using a different bar or whatever, you can put it as a secondary movement. But again, I would make sure that you're squatting 2 times a week to be able to kind of run through that and see the benefit from it. If you are squatting 1 time a week, you can go with an A and a B week cycle to where your A week can be your main squat move of the day. Maybe it's just a regular back squat. Maybe it's a safety bar, whatever it is. Your B week or your second week, your variation is now going to be the pause squat as your main movement. And you alternate between A and B weeks for 3, 4, maybe 5 cycles at the absolute most, trying to build some positive momentum there. So you still get touches with the pause squat, but you're not always pause squatting every week. Right. So obviously it's going to draw out your results a little bit, but if you're only able to say train 3 days a week and you're going to squat, bench, deadlift variation, because that's what just works best for you in recovery, right? There are reasons why people only squat 1 day a week. It's all they can make work. That would be a way that you could go about that as well. So from a volume consideration perspective, though, this is pretty crucial because clearly pause squats are going to be more demanding than your regular squat because of the time under tension. So where you normally might do, say, 5 sets of 5 on a regular back squat day, you might choose to do 4 sets of 3 on pause squats with that same weight or a similar-ish weight, right? So a good way that I like to look at it is what I would normally program my regular squat volume in terms of sets and reps. I usually take that volume and pull it down in half in terms of sets and reps. So this 4x3, 5x5 is a fantastic example. A normal squat day would be 25 repetitions of working sets. Pause squats, 4x3 would be 12. That's pretty much half, right? So you can play with that a little bit. For me, that's kind of the recipe that I've really kind of grown to like when it comes to pause squats. The extended time retention and the isometric challenge also mean that you're going to clearly accumulate more fatigue faster, and you're probably going to need some longer rest periods between sets compared to other supplemental or accessory exercises as well. When it comes to rest periods, plan for plenty of rest, just like any other kind of squat variation, typically 3 to 5 minutes like you do with a regular big compound powerlifting-based movement, rather than maybe the normal 2 to 3 minutes you would use for like a harder accessory exercise like a leg press or a hack squat, right? So your nervous system does need a little more time to recover, not only from the time under tension, but also just from the isometric piece as well. Remember, there's a neurological piece here as well, not just the muscle piece. From an intensity side, most people should start with loads around 70-ish% of their normal squat max, maybe closer to 80% if you're a little more advanced. That's usually a good place to start, especially for the 2 to 3 second pauses. It may seem light at first, but just remember you're trying to reduce the stretch shortening cycle out of the exercise and adding in an isometric component. So while the load might feel light, I assure you it will catch up with you either over the course of the set or over the course of the multiple sets that you're doing. And then even experienced lifters are really pretty kind of surprised at how challenging that pause squats can be and how much work they take out of you. So, I mean, if you've followed anybody that's pretty strong, you watch kind of their pause squat training, or if they show any other pause squats, that their loads are not nearly as intensive or as heavy as their normal squat training is. So let's talk about some progressions here. So progression with pause squats are going to require some different approaches than just your regular squat because you have two variables to manipulate here. One's going to be the load, and the other one's going to be the pause duration, where with your normal squat, it's pretty much just the load, right? Unless you start mixing in bands, chains, bars, and things of that nature. So this actually gives you more flexibility in your programming, but it also requires a little more careful planning on your programming side. So for beginners, for pause squats, I recommend starting with, again, that pause duration and load that allows you to complete all your planned sets and reps with the best technique that you possibly can. Like, you want to try to make technique the most important aspect of your pause squat outside of anything else. Don't worry too much about the load or anything else. Get the technique and the pauses down and really hammer that home, because you're going to want to hammer that neurological piece early. You don't want to ingrain bad movement patterns or bad habits. So this, for example, might start with like a 1 second pause at like 60, 65, maybe up to 70% of your normal squat max or squat run max. From there, you can then progress by either extending the pause duration so you can keep the weight the same and try to extend those pauses, like over a three-week wave, for example. You can say you've got 185 on there and you're doing 3 sets of 3, right, with a 1 second pause. Next week, you're going to do 3 sets of 3 with a 2 count pause. And next week, you're going to do 3 sets of 3 with a 3 count pause, all with the same weight of 185, right? That's one way you can progress the exercise. And all you did was just increase your time and attention and your isometric work in that position. That's still progress. Okay. It doesn't have to be just about doing more reps or doing more weight, as we kind of mentioned earlier. And then you can do that for, a 2 or 3 week cycle. And then you can kind of either increase the weight, you can add in some more volume, right? There's different ways you can go about that as well. So a sample progression that you can also use that I have written down here as well, as I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit, but weeks 1 and 2, you'll do like a 1 count pause at around 65, 70% for 4 sets of 5. And then the next 2 weeks, you're going to do for about a 2 count pause with the same weight. And then weeks 5 to 6, keep that weight the same, maybe add a rep, maybe add a set. And then week 7 to 8, you're going to increase the weight by 5 to 10 pounds and hammer that home. And then you repeat the cycle. So you're going to get a 2-month training period, really kind of working with around the same weight the whole time. The last week, you're going to kind of increase the weight by 5 to 10 pounds. And then you can rinse and repeat. And you can probably run that for a whole year and make a shit ton of progress. For intermediate lifters, I like a progression model that varies both the load and the pause duration within the same training block. So you might do shorter pauses with heavier weights earlier in your week, kind of like a max effort style, and then longer pauses with moderate weights later in the week. So it gives you the benefits of both the loading aspect of taking maximal loads at the bottom, but also then having extended isometric work as well later on in the week. So that's another way that you can go about it if you want to double down in twice a week. I've also used, speaking of the conjugate stuff, I've also used pause speed squats. And so I really like these with bands because the bands, again, have the orthopedic eccentrics. So one, it teaches you how to yield and stop faster. And then it's going to teach you how to stay tight because the bands are constantly trying to pull you down. So you got to keep pushing into them a little bit. And then it teaches you how to, again, develop that rate of force development out of the pause position to then come up out of the bottom. For advanced lifters, you can use even more complex periodization strategies. That conjugate one of mine is what I use from a conjugate perspective at times for people. So you might do a block just focused on maximum pause duration with moderate loads, followed by a block of just focusing on heavier loads with shorter pauses. And then you might do a training block that brings both of those together to some degree. For some advanced lifters, even the use of pause squats as an overreaching tool, doing extremely long pauses for higher volumes for 2 or 3 weeks is a way to accumulate a lot of volume and fatigue. And then you can, pull back, deload, unload, whatever you want to call it, and then backing off to a regular squat and then seeing what your strength looks like, a week or two later. So, you can use it as an overreaching method because of the time under tension. Not something that I'm a huge fan of, if I'm being honest. I think there's better ways to go about it, but it is a legitimate option if you are really, really trying to focus on that bottom position, and it isn't really a pain in the ass in terms of making progress down there. So just the key with any kind of progression as well is just obviously you want to track your progress, both your regular squat and your pause squat performance, and how those are kind of intertwining and mixing together. And are you seeing positive correlations? Clearly, you also need to give yourself time to see those come to fruition. But the goal is always to make your overall squatting pattern stronger, not just to get better at pause squats. Okay, that's kind of the key thing here from a pause squat perspective. So some practical implementation, common mistakes that I see here. So the technical aspects of executing a perfect pause squat, because the small details can make a huge difference when I go back to talking about the positioning of where you're at in the lift, right? So first, let's address just the pause position itself. The pause should occur at your normal squat depth, right? So usually we are going to reverse your squat from a competitive perspective, or if you're using it for sport athletes, where they would normally be reversing the action. And then the same bottom position you use for your regular squat. So they should be the same. Don't artificially go deeper just because you're pausing, and don't cut your depth short, thinking that it will make the pause easier. Consistency with your pattern is going to be crucial for transfer, especially when it comes to the pause squats. We talked about being joint angle specific. Get as close as you can to whatever that competition depth is for you. Now, during the pause, your goal is to maintain that exact same position that you arrived in, kind of hammering this home the whole episode. Get in the right freaking position and exit in the right freaking position. This means maintaining the proper back angle, your knee tracking, weight distribution in your feet, right? Your tightness. Many lifters make the mistake of settling into a different position in the pause rather than shifting their weight or changing their position, because when the weight's down there, you're going to be like, oh, I can kind of lean forward a little bit more, or I can kind of be a little more upright, or I can let my butt sink a little bit lower, right? Don't want to do that if you can really avoid it. It's not going to be ideal and not have as much transfer. Now, here's a crucial point about tension during the pause. You want to maintain as much muscular tension throughout your entire body, but you don't want to necessarily hold your breath where you're going to create so much tension that you're going to pass out, right? Or you can't move when it's time to stand up. So you got to be nice and tight, just like when you compete, rigid, right? From toe all the way up into upper back as you're squeezing that barbell, right? You want to be as tight as you possibly can. And think about coiling up like a spring down in that position, maintaining all that tension and readiness so that while you can actually be just relaxed enough to explode up out of the bottom when the time's there. And when you're exploding out of the bottom, we want to make sure our traps and upper back are driving up into that barbell so that when we actually go up, our butt doesn't kick back and our chest doesn't fall forward, right? We don't want that to happen. So breathing during pause squats can be kind of a pain. So there's some different things here that you can go about. I'll kind of talk about what I prefer, but this is kind of personal preference. For shorter pauses, 1 to 2 counts, you should typically hold your breath through the entire rep, okay? Just like you would a regular squat. I think if you really need a breath that badly, you probably need to work on your GPP and your conditioning. For longer pauses of 3 or more, you'll likely need to breathe or let out a little sigh of air and then go, right? You shouldn't have to re-breathe in or anything, but you need to just let out a little bit of air. I understand that. So ideally, though, you're still going to try to hold your breath and a tightness as much as you can. But if we're talking about a 5-count pause, like that can really get you, right? So the technique here is to take the big breath at the top, descend with that breath held, then take a small, like I said, a very small breath in or out if you need to, depending on what you feel you need. Chances are you probably feel like you need more air, so you're probably going to go in and breathe in again. And if you can, do it through your nose. That way, you're going to be able to not have as big of a breath, because if you go like this, you can see how my chest rises. If I breathe in through my nose, my chest doesn't necessarily rise, so I can maintain my position better if you do need to take that breath in. And so then when you're ready to stand, then you can just drive back up. So the transition from the pause to ascending or coming up from there is where many people struggle. So the key again is to think of it in kind of like a two-part or two-phase aspect of the lift. First, you're going to initiate the movement again, driving your upper back up into the barbell, and your feet are still going to feel like they're pushing like a leg press to drive your chest up out of the bottom. And then your legs and your hips and your glutes will come forward to finish the completion or stand-up position of the exercise. So this will prevent you from actually pitching forward, like I talked about Good Morning, or your butt kicking back. So think about pressure up into the bar with your traps and then drive your hips through. So some programming mistakes to avoid. So the most common mistakes that I see when it comes to pause squats are pretty big because they can avoid you from spinning your wheels, right? That's the last thing you want to do is try new things. And I think experimenting is important as an individual. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes, but there's a lot of people that have already made the mistakes for you. So if you don't have to make them, I think that's a win. The biggest mistake for sure is doing just too much, too soon, too fast, right? Just like with almost any training thing, you get gung-ho about something and you go all in. And I think doing too much, too fast, too soon, one, it makes it harder to make progress when you stall. You microdose stuff, and it makes it easier to build on as you go. But I usually see lifters just trying to jump straight into stupid long 5-count pauses, or using too much weight, or they can't complete the sets and the reps at the RPE that they're supposed to, or they're trying to push that to the maximum and then their technique compromises. They're not really getting the intended benefit of being not only statically strong down there, but in the right biomechanical position to optimize it for it to transfer over to their competition squat. So something worth considering there, that they are a skill and they still need to be developed progressively, right? It doesn't matter how strong you are. You do want to still build into them correctly. Then another common error, using pause squats as a test rather than a training tool. Some lifters will throw pause squats in randomly when they feel like challenging themselves rather than doing them programmed systematically. It doesn't really allow for kind of any progression or adaptation. It's almost just like a social media show off. Dave Tays kind of talked about having testers and builders. The pause squat is a builder, no question. Yes, your pause squat can get better and you could test it, but the problem with the pause squat is the length of the pause and where you're pausing at specifically can change a little bit. And if you're really trying to push a 1 rep max on a pause squat, I guarantee you're either going to squat higher or your pauses are going to get shorter and you're going to say you hit a PR and you really didn't. And I've kind of talked about the same phenomenon with pause deadlift and why I don't like it. Same thing kind of goes back to the pause squat. Use it as a builder, not a tester. Going back to like just general weight selection, most people are just picking weight selections really, really badly. They either go way too heavy and can't maintain that position, or they go too light and don't get a sufficient enough overload in that position. So for most people, just to give you some ranges here, most people, 70 to 85% of your normal squat max is kind of a good range that your training weights should be in, right? You could certainly get down to the 60% range, especially early on, or if you're having some pretty long pauses, right? But for the most part, that 70, 85% range is to me like the sweet spot to be able to know if you're in the right working zones load wise and being able to maintain obviously your proper technique. Timing and consistency is another issue. So, if you're doing 3-second pauses and they should actually be 3 seconds, but you're making them 2 seconds because the weight's feeling heavy, then that begins to be a problem, right? You either need to back the load off or determine, hey, do I just need to have shorter pauses to see that benefit? Right. So there's some different ways you can go out there, but being consistent in your pause duration is going to be pretty crucial to be able to track progress long-term, but also be able to get some of that proper adaptations from the longer duration pauses if that's what you're trying to use. And then the final issue that I see here as well is that people will just also throw their regular squat training out the window and just hammer pause squats for a while. Again, going back to what I've kind of said here is that they're incredibly valuable, but they are not a replacement for your normal squat training. It's a supplemental exercise. That's why it's called a supplemental exercise. You can still use it as a main movement, but it is not a replacement for the main movement for your training, or at least should not be, at least for not extended periods of time. A couple weeks, one thing. I'm talking about 12 to 16 week training cycles, not a good idea. So let's address some common issues you might encounter when implementing the pause squats and how you can go about solving them. So if you can't maintain your position during this pause, you're falling forward, your knees are caving in, or you're losing balance, this typically indicates mobility limitations or strength imbalances. The pause is clearly exposing. So the solution isn't just to avoid pause squats, right? The goal is to address the underlying issues while potentially reducing the pause duration or load until your mobility and stability improve. So ankle mobility, hip mobility, right? Those are things that may need to be addressed. I do find personally that doing pause squats for the most part for a lot of people do help their hips feel better. So something worth considering. For your mobility issues, getting clearly focused on your ankle dorsiflexion, hip flexion, T-spine extension. Those are all crucial for your normal squat patterns in general. So clearly 10 to 15 minutes on off days could go a long way here. Also warming up with goblet squats with a pause can be a great way to shift center of mass back, have an anterior load, develop more back strength, get the abdominals working, grease a groove, slide in and out side to side in that pause squat with the goblet position to work on your squat mobility before you get underneath the barbell. Also a great thing you can do. If you're experiencing knee pain, though, with your pause squats, this could be often related to increased time and retention in that position, right? So make sure you're just getting a nice quality warm-up. Consider reducing the pause duration, cut your pause a little bit shorter until they adapt. Or you can also reach out to a PT, probably something if you're having a lot of knee pain, probably worth doing. The other option is doing Spanish squat isometric holds for 30 to 45 seconds for a couple sets. Then go get back underneath the barbell and see if that helps us feel better. Getting some isometric work with those also can be a great way to alleviate anterior knee pain or patellofemoral knee pain as well. Another piece here is that some lifters find they can pause comfortably but struggle to initiate the movement from the bottom. So this is usually kind of like a motor pattern issue. Your body needs to learn how to drive their upper back up into the barbell to generate that force from that dead stop position. So this might be you need to go back a couple steps and practice quality box squatting technique with a nice solid pause on the box, old school a la West Side, nice, good quality box squat, and then driving through your feet, driving your upper back up into the barbell, and then do that for maybe 3 to 4 weeks, and then go back to your pause squat and see if that helps you. Again, when you're on the box, though, diving a little bit deeper into box squats here is that you don't completely relax on the box. You maintain that tightness. You want that tightness to transfer over to your pause squat. So it's just a regression that pauses are not your friend, or you're not very good at them. Try a cycle of box squats and then try the pause squats, and I guarantee your pause squat will be better. Those that can box squat well can pause squat well. If you happen to be a lifter that feels pretty unstable during the pause, shoes can be a big piece of it, right? I can't believe I have to say this, but making sure you have the right type of shoes to train in can make a big difference. So a more stable shoe is going to be in a much better position to be able to stay solid rather than just having like a regular old tennis shoe. For most powerlifters, I feel like they shouldn't have to say that, but you would actually be amazed how many people just train some pretty awkward shoes nowadays. Then if you're not seeing the expected carryover to your regular squats, now it's time to look at programming, right? Are you doing enough volume of the pause squats to drive your adaptation? Are you progressively overloading both the pause duration and the weight? Are you giving adaptation time to occur? Like, are you trying to rush things too much? Is that why you're not seeing progress? Are you getting enough protein? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting enough hydration? Are your accessory exercises also complementing where you kind of need to get some work, right? Are you making sure that you're not too overloaded on volume of work for everything else, right? Just because you add pause squats in, you can't just add it on top of everything else you're doing, right? You probably need to take something away. So find that balance there to keep that workload manageable. I think if you really implement pause squats from 4 to 8 weeks, you should actually start to be able to see and feel a difference by the end of that time frame. Okay, some real world applications here. So let's see how different athletes and lifters can use pause squats to improve their performance goals. So for powerlifters, pause squats in my opinion, are almost mandatory to train to get better at the bottom position. And you don't have to, but I do think that they are really important to do. But beyond the competition side, powerlifters use pauses to identify and fix weaknesses as well. So you can use that as an assessment tool of what's going on. So if you're failing at the bottom, obviously that's why you're probably listening to this, but the pause squat is going to direct that. If you're also failing at the sticking point or midway, pause squats can also help there as well to develop that starting strength and accelerate to that position. Weightlifters use pause squats pretty differently. They're usually more concerned with the front squat pause variations because of catching the clean to improve their ability to recover from those. But a weightlifter can also, front squat super heavy, but struggles to clean, say, close to that weight. Obviously has a weakness in the bottom of that position of catching the weight, right? So if their clean's pretty close to that pause squat position, probably want to raise that pause front squat position up to be able to drive the floor up to be able to get that exercise up higher. It also teaches them to be confident and strong in the receiving aspect of the clean. So I know we're really pretty powerlifting heavy, but hey, weightlifters can benefit from this stuff too. And just for general strength training people, you're not a powerlifter, you just like getting strong as shit. I feel you. Pause squats can, one, help you just break through your plateau of any kind of squat issues you might be having and improve your movement quality of your squats. If you've been squatting the same weight for a long time, 4 to 8 weeks of doing pause squats, implemented as a supplemental or secondary exercise can really kickstart your progress and get things moving in the right direction. The improved strength and stability in the bottom position is going to allow you to handle heavier weights whenever you go to chimps, new PRs, or new working sets. We can even talk about CrossFit athletes. They can also benefit as well from pause squats. They obviously train all the modalities all the time, and they're trying to see some pretty big progress in their WODs and their competitions. So this really helps improve their general strength endurance and their stability under fatigue. And so when they're doing their cleans or their thrusters at high intensities, high efforts, the ability to stay strong and tight in those bottom positions can let them be more efficient in some of the other movements that they do. So I do think there's a lot of carryover there, probably something that a lot of them don't use that they definitely could and see some pretty big benefits from. So let's scroll on down here to besides just the squats. So just the principles of pause training, just in general, extend beyond squats. Understanding these applications can benefit you from other training aspects as well. I kind of talked about the deadlift separately in the past, but this also works, with your bench press or a split squat, right? Or a row, right? There's different ways that you can use pauses and isometrics. And so mix those around in your other lifts as well. But this episode clearly is geared towards the pause squat, but you got an idea of some places you might be able to start with the exercises if you are interested in implementing it elsewhere in your training. So let's talk about some action steps here. Things you can do to get started if this is up your alley. So if you're convinced that pause squats should be a part of your training and you're not using them, let's figure out how you can start using them ASAP. So first, let's establish your baseline. I'm always a big fan of assess, test, retest, whatever you want to call it. So before you add pause squats to your program, you need to know what your current squat looks like from a technical perspective and what it feels like at the bottom position. So you need to probably film yourself doing 85% plus of your regular squat so you can see some technical breakdowns, how you're entering the hole. The heavier you can get, the better, right, to be able to have a better assessment. But I'm not going to tell you just go 1 rep max just to be able to implement pause squats. Just find a pretty recent video or training day that you've got. And then next time you're doing your normal squats, once you get to about 60, 70%, just do a couple pause squat reps as you're warming up. Don't necessarily count as part of your workout. Just use as assessment, see how it feels, how stable you are. Does it feel any different than your regular squat? Film it. Does it look any different, right? Compare them side by side. See if there's anything going on. That could be a way to immediately determine whether you've got any red flags from a positional standpoint, as we talked about entering and exiting the bottom position of your squat. Then for your first pause squat session, say you're going to start implementing them. Again, start off just replacing your main squat work just entirely with pause squats initially, just to get a lot of practice in and work on them, assuming you're squatting twice a week. Don't try to do both types of squats in the same session early on as you're going and starting. Start with that weight again at that 67% range and slowly work in. Start off with 1 count pauses if you're a beginner or you're new to this. And then keep your set and rep scheme pretty conservative, maybe 3 to 4 sets of 3 to 5 reps, ample rest between, again, using 1 counts. And then just make sure that you're doing all the appropriate safety stuff, right? I'm not going to go into any of that, but clearly make sure if you're training by yourself using pause squats, you got some safeties available to you. So if you do have to bail it, you get stuck down there, you are able to dump the weight. And then also, you got to have a little bit of buy-in, right? You've got to mentally commit yourself to this movement. Again, like I said, 6 to 8 weeks for me is kind of the minimum to start seeing progress. If you're not getting ready for a meet, then now's the perfect time to start working on them because there's really no negative side effects to it. If you would be getting ready for a meet or about to get ready for a meet, it may not be the best thing, right? If you kind of know what's going to work and what you need to work on, you don't want to throw in new variables into training preps that you've not played around with to see progress with before. But if you do have a valid coach that you're interested in working with or thinking about using pauses, I think that's also a very considerable thing to ask and see in your training program if it can benefit you. So just commit to it and be ready to embrace the suck, but you'll also see a huge progress from it. So I'm not going to go too much longer into this. I've got some extra notes here. I will go into this portion of it that for like a 4-week implementation strategy. So here's a good 4 weeks that you can immediately take away today to put in your training. So week 1, focus on learning the pattern, 1 count pauses, 67% of your regular squat max. Do like 4 sets of 4 reps, right? Just focus on getting everything, feeling good, feeling the exercise out, get the ball rolling. Week 2, we're going to move to a 2-count pause with the same weight, and then we're going to do the exact same thing. 4 sets of 4, start paying attention to how you're feeling, if you feel more tight, and if you're feeling a little more stable. Week 3, we're going to stay with those 2-count pauses, but now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go with 4 sets of 3. We're going to increase the weight slightly, 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds, depending on how strong you are, and continue to progress that, okay? Increase the loading. Week 4 is where we're really going to push it. So we're going to keep the 2-second pause, but now we're going to go with 4 sets of 2, ramping up over the course of those 4 sets of 2. So you might have started off about what you were using for week 3 and add weight successfully over the course of that to where you end up around RP 8.5, 9 feel. So you're probably closer to the 80, 85% range if you're going off your 1 rep max perspective to give you an idea. And then it gives you an idea of kind of where you're at with everything, right? So you've hit some volume, got some practice, you worked up to a hard double, and now you kind of have a baseline of kind of what that feels like to have to grind through it. And then you can long-term integrate that elsewhere into your program as a supplemental movement because now you've got numbers to base off of and how those correlate with your normal squat training as well. I like personally having pause squats. I said pretty consistently in the off season for many of my athletes that I work with. And then early on in preps, and as preps get going, I take the pause squats out or they get very, very low on the volume side, right? We just hit a couple sets of maybe 2 reps and then we're out. So to wrap up here, the pause squat piece, let me leave you here, with the 3 most important points to determine your success using pause squats. So first, understand that they're a tool, not a replacement. They serve a specific purpose in your training, building strength and stability in the weakest position of the lift, improving your motor control, breaking through plateaus, all that great stuff. Use them strategically and systematically, not randomly, and you will see progress with them. Second, progression is everything with this exercise. Start with shorter pauses and lighter weights than you think you need. You will have the temptation to make big jumps early, especially when it comes to making longer pauses or heavier weights. But just slowly chip away like you would any other training means, gradually build up over weeks and months, and then you will beautifully swing into dominating the movement as a whole and then seeing it compound into your actual squat pattern. And third is just going to be trust the process with this exercise. The benefits of pause squats are going to take some time to really manifest before you really start to notice them, especially from a physical side, right? So don't just abandon it if you're not immediately seeing progress. You're not going to see a 20-pound squat PR after 3 weeks of doing pause squats. It doesn't work that way. The strength and stability that you're building out of the movement is going to happen. Just going to take you some time, and you will probably really start to see it show up in your dynamic movements after about that 6 to 8 week period, as I mentioned. So the biggest mistake that you can make is thinking that the pause squats are just regular old-fashioned squats with a stomp added. That's not true. They're completely different stimulus. It requires different programming, different thought processes, different mental approach. You need to have different expectations of what you're getting from the exercise and how you're going into each set. And then you also need to respect the movement, and it will reward you in the long run when it comes to building your squat. So the immediate action is start putting freaking pause squats in your training program. If you are a powerlifter and you're stuck in the bottom and you're not doing them, this is your thing to do more pause squats. I kind of laid everything out here to get you started how to get going. So I hope you enjoyed the episode today. I'm really looking forward to the next episode. But until then, go squat, get underneath the bar, build a stupid song squat. Thanks for tuning in for today's episode. I appreciate having you, whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple iTunes, whatever podcasting, streaming service that you enjoy. I appreciate you listening to me there. Or if you're listening to me on YouTube, again, I appreciate you watching the video. You can hit that like button. If you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button where you can get more episodes and more YouTube content every single week. And as I said, thanks for, again, listening to the Thirst for More podcast, and I'll see you at the next episode.